with African Americans, and we talked about it, where there was this large movement, if you will, migration. What's it called? The what? The Great Migration. And what was this Great Migration? Black folks was leaving the South. We were leaving the South and we were going up north. Why were we leaving the South? Jim Crow, right? All kinds of, not only Jim Crow, there was another major thing that was going on in the South and in the Midwest. It was a means of punishing us for being criminals. Well, this led to mass incarceration. Strange fruit. Lynching, right, lynching, okay? So lynching was happening. Lynching was rampant in the South and in the Midwest. And so because of this, Black folks were saying, you know what? We have to find a way to ensure that our lives and our futures are maintained for our children and our grandchildren. And so we started to participate in something that was called the Great Migration. Now, before we get into that, let's see. Okay, so before we get into that, I want to talk about one specific person that came about during this time period. His name was Marcus Garvey. And I think Marcus Garvey is important and he deserves kind of his own highlight because it was out of Marcus Garvey's movement that a lot of our thinking, a lot of our collective Black consciousness was created. Now, Garvey wasn't the first person that talked about this. And we discussed this, I want to say maybe last month or about a month and a half ago. We talked about other Black people like Henry McNeil Turner, right? And other Black pastors that while you have folks like Frederick Douglass who believed in integration, who believed in fighting for the United States during the Civil War so that we can maintain our rights, you had other folks that were saying we need to completely separate from white people. We need to completely build our own nation, whether that be going back to Africa or build our own nation right here in the Americas, right? And so because of that, you have folks like Henry McNeil Turner, you have folks like David Walker and David Walker's Appeal. You had all of these different people that begin to set a tradition of what we call self-determination, right? And so Marcus Garvey just came out of that tradition of self-determination. So he wasn't the first, but what he did do, he created the largest Black movement that we have still ever seen, including the Civil Rights Movement, including Black Lives Matter. We have yet to see an organized movement that has been as large in mass as Marcus Garvey's movement. And so we want to start with his perspective, and you can read the entire thing. I have the document here on African fundamentalism. And what it says is the time has come for the African to forget and cast behind him his hero worship and adoration of other races, and to start out immediately to create and emulate heroes of his own. We must canonize our own saints, create our own martyrs, and elevate to positions of fame and honor Black women and men who have made their distinct contributions to our history. God and nature first made us what we are, and then out of our own creative genius, we make ourselves what we want to be. Follow always the great law. Let the sky and God be our limit, and eternity our measurement. There is no height to which we cannot climb by using the active intelligence of our own. And so when we think about just this short kind of pericope of what Marcus Garvey is saying, what is it that he's trying to get across to us as a people? Okay. We need to look at ourselves. We need to turn to each other. What else? We have to create our own destiny. self-empowerment, okay? These are the themes that Marcus Garvey has in his writings, and not only his writings, but his institutions that he began to build. Why do you think that he's saying this right here? Why do you think he's pushing forth these ideas of looking to self and self-determination? And he says we should canonize our own saints and create our own martyrs. Why do you think he's saying this?
Because it creates, if we're not looking at ourselves, it creates a hierarchy. If I'm looking at the judge, and the judge happens to be white, police are white, God is white. It's a hierarchy. So the child development, I can walk around the best people in the world and start questioning and saying, how come I don't live like Johnny? Because we don't have ego. And we do, but
right.
For example, we just have MLK. They talk about that, but in our heart of hearts, a lot of us identify with Malcolm. It's hard that, and a lot of times we shouldn't wait for them to crown our king.
Right. So then who were we looking to before? If he has to make this statement, who are we looking to before?
Concepts and ways and norms. And way of having us think, awakening the thinking that we have to break out how crucial it was for us to break out.
Absolutely. Even when we go to our Black national anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Lift Every Voice and Sing was an anthem that was created to celebrate both a Black and a white person. It was made to celebrate Frederick Douglass as well as Abraham Lincoln, right? So we were always taught to look to them, to look to Europe, to look to the Americas, to look to white people as sometimes our leaders, sometimes people that were influential in who we are and where we're from. We were always kind of, those were the heroes that were put in front of us. And Marcus Garvey is saying, if we learn our history, if we learn our culture, we'll realize that all that we need and all that we need to move forward, all that we need to break out of this current condition that we're in, we just need to look to ourselves. In fact, we need to look back to Africa. Because if we go back to Africa, we'll see that everything that we're trying to do, we've already done anyway. Right? So this is what he's trying to look for and create, right?
Marcus Garvey promoted nationalism and self-sufficiency, like nationhood for diaspora peoples physically. And I should point out that he particularly looked to Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee models for that type of basis for self-sufficiency. I think that gets missed in history books a lot, but Booker T. Washington's visions were to use that Tuskegee model to help various peoples on the continent be self-sufficient when it came to the industrialization of cotton and stuff like that. And then to Togo, it was formerly a German colony. That all gets missed, and how all these other HBCU land grant colleges that were promoting self-sufficiency, agriculture, technology, mechanical arts, sprang from the Tuskegee model. Not only did Marcus Garvey believe in that, unfortunately, he wasn't able to hook up with Booker T. Washington since Booker T. Washington just died.
So you kind of skipping. Wait, just you rolling, and I appreciate that. But we're gonna get to all of that. So we got all of that coming up. Marcus Garvey, right? Originally born in Jamaica, right? And then he was later on. He was called Black Moses. He was called Little Messiah. He was born in St. Ann's Bay in the north coast of Jamaica.
Marcus Garvey
Eventually, he was about 14 years old when he left school. He left school and he started working in a printing company in Kingston, Jamaica. And so he perfected these skills of printing and he learned about the written word. He became a publisher, a journalist. And then around 20 years old, he really started to come into his own in terms of his own consciousness. Just a couple of things about him before we continue to move on. He got married twice. He married a woman by the name of Amy Ashwood, and then he married another woman named Amy Jacques. So clearly he liked women named Amy. He was married twice, and he started the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which eventually led to about 6 million members and over 900 chapters. I think this is something that gets overlooked in our history books. This is a lot of people in the 1920s. In the 1920s that were members, many of them paying members of the UNIA, and he utilized the stock market to help create businesses and continue to raise money for the UNIA solely for the purpose of liberating Black people and in his perspective, to take Black people back to Africa, back to their original ancestral and spiritual homeland. So, and I don't think we've had a movement this large ever since, right? And this was almost over 100 years ago. So these are just a couple pictures of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was one, oftentimes we are told that there's this kind of a Garvey-Du Bois debate in terms of you have Du Bois who was the educated one. You had Du Bois who was the one who believed in civil rights and fighting for our rights, and because he had a PhD and more so leaned more towards the middle class. And to some degree, it may be true, because as we go into the Harlem Renaissance and we talk a little bit about the talented 10, we're going to see that there was this kind of elitism that Du Bois portrayed in some ways. And Garvey was more for the people, for the working class, for the common man, as if he did not appreciate or value education. But Marcus Garvey absolutely valued education. And oftentimes you would see him in the academic regalia, in the academic robe, and he studied educated Black people, particularly Black Americans, like you said. Booker T. Washington was one of his favorites, right? Among others, and we'll talk about that in a second. So this is just a picture of Marcus Garvey, likely in a caravan of people during one of his famous marches down Harlem, New York. Okay, and then this is a very famous picture of Marcus Garvey that many of us have seen. He was also one who believed in military, so you would see him in academic regalia. You would also see him in military regalia as well, because he believed that Black people should have their own nation. And in having your own nation, you need to have your own military. So he believed in Black people being able to defend themselves as well. And so you would oftentimes see him in that. Some people believe maybe some of this power kind of went to his head and he eventually labeled himself, I think, like the all supreme leader of Africa or something to that nature. But largely with his movement, he wanted to see Black people fully and completely liberated from white racism and white supremacy. Much of his, he would lead these large marches. And again, you can see pictures and Google images of this, where he would have these large marches with Black women and Black men, and he would get all of the organizations, the nursing organizations, Black women nurses, Black men in the military, and they would all be a part of these marches that he would lead to showcase the display and the lore of the UNIA movement, to show that this movement was not small. It was extremely large. And really what he would do is, this was actually a reflection of some of the larger marches that would happen when the American soldiers would come back from World War I. So in World War I, American soldiers, after I think World War I ended in 1915, 1917, something of that nature, when they came back, they would have these huge marches in major cities all over the United States. And they would do this to celebrate our soldiers and to celebrate American life and American culture and that America had just won this war. And they would have these large marches. And so Garvey said, well, if they can do it, we can do it. And so he began to take hundreds and thousands of UNI members, and in Harlem, in the blackest city of the nation at that time, he began to have these large marches of only black people to showcase the lore and to showcase the valor of the UNIA movement. And so again, you can see this is just a quick shot, but people would be hanging over their windows and on their balconies watching this movement of nothing but black people during these marches, showcasing Garvey's movement and the UNIA movement of black people looking to be completely liberated from white folks. And so the peak of Marcus Garvey's reign, the peak of Marcus Garvey's movement was about 1920 to about 1922. And something that was very important to him was Africa for the Africans. Africa for the Africans. What does that mean? Africa for the Africans.
Totality of African thought, African ways, everything black.
Everything black. Okay, absolutely. Africa for the Africans. What do you think? Why do you think that was important? Hold on. Yeah. Because remember what we talked about just a couple of classes ago, colonialism. It wasn't just Jim Crow that was happening in the United States. That wasn't the only type of oppression that was going on. Europe was literally taking over, scrambling, and piecing out certain parts of Africa and stripping it of its resources, giving the Africans back very little back to just enough for them to live so that they can stay alive and they can continue to use them for a labor force. They were literally stripping and taking everything they could out of Africa, specifically the wealth out of Africa, right? And so Garvey understood this. And we're going to talk a little bit about how Garvey began to learn about these things in Jamaica. He understood this. And so he was one of the first people, one of the first people here in the Americas to say, hey, Africa should be for African people, and not just African people on the continent, but African people worldwide. We all have a stake in what is happening in Africa, and the fact that Europeans are the only people that are benefiting from what God blessed this continent with, that's a problem. And so that was one of his major themes, is Africa for the Africans, Africa for the Africans. So that was his, that was very important to Garvey. So around 1912, Garvey went to London, right? So he was still very young at this time. Garvey went to London and he began to associate with a black nationalist by the name of Dusé Muhammad Ali. And he learned a lot from Brother Muhammad, and he started to write articles for him in something that was known as the African Times. And that was where he began to capitalize on, as well as sharpen his publishing skills and his writing skills. In addition to that, he started to read, like Brother Baruti said, he started to read a book called Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington. And Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington was Booker T. Washington's story about being born enslaved. But not only that, it also taught the teachings of self-determination, doing for yourself, having your own land, owning your own land, and then taking that land, using your hands and building the homes, building the schools, building the institutions that we create. He was all about taking your bucket and casting it where you are, right there. For much of that time, other black leaders were teaching, let's try to fight for our rights. Let's try to get access to what the United States already has. Let's try to get into those institutions. Let's try to blend into that culture. And Booker T. Washington is saying, not right now, because we have enough talent in our own to build up our own institutions and to build up our own schools. And so this idea, Marcus Garvey took some of it, not all of it, but he took some of these ideas and he began to use this to be the basis for his own movement. And so So he read Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington, and then he began to ask, where is the black man's government? Where is the black man's kingdom? Where's the black man's army, his navy, his men of big affairs? And he said, since I cannot find them, I will help make them. And I think that's so key because many times in our community, many times in our lives, we may see something that doesn't exist and we get mad, we may complain, we see a void, but instead of seeing, or when you see a void and then get upset about it, which is fine, then what's the next step? Action. You fill the void if you can. You fill the void, right? Or find ways to help fill the void. And so that's essentially what Garvey did. I don't see what I think should exist, so I'm going to do what I can to make it exist. Garvey recognized that the only way to deal meaningfully with the black man's white international oppression, which again is very important because much of what we were doing at this time was very much isolated in our own countries, in our own oppression. And Garvey is connecting our oppressions, and he's saying what's happening in the Americas affects our people in Africa and vice versa, and in the Caribbean, as a person who was from the Caribbean. So in 1914, he established, again, what we talked about, the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And so in 1916, Marcus Garvey came to the United States. And his reason for coming to the United States was to find Booker T. Washington. He said, I got to find the man that wrote this book. I got to meet him. I got to see him. He has to teach me more. And so he moved here to find him. What do you think happened when he got here? Booker T. Washington was dead. He didn't know he had died because there was no internet, so he couldn't Google that, right? So he got here to find him, come to find out he was dead. So Garvey was heartbroken. And he said, well, since I'm here and I know how to, I'm a publisher, I know how to print, he started his own newspaper. He said he didn't want his visit here to be in vain, so he started to get to work. And so he started his own newspaper. And so he established his UNIA chapter right there in Harlem. He didn't have a whole lot of money, and so he moved in with some friends of the family that he knew from Jamaica that lived in Harlem, and he began to work as a printer. And while he was working as a printer, by night, he would stand on his soapbox and he would preach these teachings of Africa for the Africans and African fundamentalism and self-determination and do for self and all of these things he began to preach on street corners on his own. And as he began to preach this knowledge, people started coming and people started listening and people started supporting him financially. And his movement and his ideas began to grow and grow and grow. And eventually, he was able to turn this into an entire movement, and he utilized the newspaper. The newspaper was what the internet is to us now. It was the main way of communication to get your ideas out. So it would be like social media now. It would be like the internet now. And so to start his own newspaper, his ideas began to grow. And the more money he created and the more money he was able to generate, he eventually started his own shipping company, which was the Black Star Line. And what was the purpose of the Black Star Line? Yeah. He said, not only am I going to tell you to go back to Africa, I'm going to take you. Get on these boats. All right? Because a lot of times, sometimes even, and this is something I've learned in my own research, and also when we look at government officials, you can create an opportunity for somebody. But if you don't create the vehicle for them to get to the opportunity, then what's the point, right? You can give somebody a job. You can say this person has a job, but if the job is 30, 45 minutes from their house, and they don't have a car, or they don't have money to get on the bus to go to the job, then it doesn't really help, right? And so I think sometimes we kind of forget these things when we are looking for when we're looking for people to give us what we deserve, when we're looking for change, when we create change, or when we create these ideas. Sometimes you can have these ideas, but you also have to give people the vehicle to get to the idea. And so he said, well, you know what? I can't just tell all these people to get up and go back to Africa because most of the people that supported me are regular working people, right? They can't get on a ship, or they may not have the money to get on a ship to go back to Africa. So I'm going to create it. I'm going to use my opportunities. I'm going to use my resources. I'm going to use my platform and create a way for Black folks to get there. And later on, we're going to talk about what happened with that Black Star Line.
Mm-hmm. For all of Dr. Du Bois' credits and merits, it was Dr. Du Bois who convinced the Liberian government not to sell land to Marcus Garvey as part of the UNIA movement for the interest of Firestone Tire Company to access all the rubber trees, most of them, so they could start their efforts. And Du Bois was used to make the Liberian government say, "Now we're not going to sell your land."
Now, I did not know that was in the interest of the Firestone Company that we know now, but I did know that, and I don't know. I thought about if I wanted to go deep into the dissension between Marcus Garvey and Du Bois, because it was big. It was big, and they was not feeling each other. Booker T. Washington as well. Yeah. So, but I was like, I don't really want to extrapolate on that because I think we see enough division in our community. Yeah, it ain't gonna get us nowhere. But no, they did not agree with each other. And they did some sneaky things to each other, Du Bois to Garvey and Garvey to Du Bois. Did some sneaky things to each other to undercut their movements. And so again, it's not to what I don't believe in doing with these classes, and I don't believe that we should sensationalize our history. And I don't believe that we should make it as if all of our people are perfect and everything we've done has been perfect and we ain't done some sneaky stuff to each other, because we have. But I don't like to harp on that. You know what I mean? Because we know it, we see it, it exists. And yes, Du Bois and Garvey were not the best of friends. They did not like each other much. Yeah. And I think eventually both of I don't know much about Du Bois and Garvey, but Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, their ideas began to kind of meet, and Du Bois started to kind of adopt some of Booker T. Washington's teachings towards the end of his life, especially when he became a communist. So, things happen. You know what I mean? You don't like everybody. Oh, yes. So another thing that Marcus Garvey did was he started Negro factories. He also understood this was on I would say maybe the tail end of the Industrial Revolution. And so he understood manufacturing. He understood that it's not only that we should have our own stores, that we should have our own restaurants. We actually have to own the factories that are creating these things, right? So I don't want us to just have a coffee shop. I want us to own the coffee beans that are making the coffee. So his ideas were huge. And they weren't just huge, and he didn't just have these big, lofty ideas. He actually set out and created this. All of this in a matter of a few years, 2-3 years. And this was in the 1900s. So Marcus Garvey was a power, and the more we learn about him, the more we see why who he was is sanitized to just one paragraph, or who he was. Many people don't want our kids to know how powerful Garvey and the Garvey movement was, because for him to do all of these things in such a short time is really phenomenal. So of course, as he's doing these things, And as people are seeing the growth of Garvey's movement, who else is seeing the growth of the white folks? And not just white folks, but the government. And so they coming for you. And the more you grow and the more influence you have and the more positivity and more elevation they start to see in their labor class, they're like, we don't want these black people doing this. And we don't want their economic ingenuity undercutting what we got going on. We got to find a way to get this dude. And so I don't know if I have it up here, but this may have happened either shortly before or shortly after he was shot. He was shot once. He didn't die, and the guy who shot him, I think I was trying to find a picture. I think his name was George Tyler. I couldn't tell if he was black or white, but there was this affiliation that he had with the UNIA. And so I'm assuming he was probably a black guy, but a black guy that was working for the government, right? The FBI. And he was, this is my opinion. There's no proof of this, but I believe very similar to, who's the guy, Chicago? Fred Hampton. Very similar to Fred Hampton. I believe he was paid off, right, by the FBI to kill Marcus Garvey. He was not successful. He was taken to prison, and he committed suicide like a day or two later, right, in prison. I think they was just mad that he didn't finish the job, and they got mad. And so then shortly after that, he was arrested on mail fraud charges. He was arrested in 1922, but they couldn't make it stick. So eventually they had to let him go. One of the things that people got mad at Garvey for was meeting with the Ku Klux Klan. He met with the Imperial Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, people got upset for that, and rightfully so. But why do you think Garvey had a meeting with an organization that was so detrimental, that was so harmful to black people? How could somebody who claimed to love black people and care for black people and build all of these institutions for black people decide that he's going to take a peaceful meeting with the opposition of who we are?
In separation, he believed that the ones who were part of the Ku Klux Klan were the most honest white people about what their beliefs were.
Mm-hmm.
No double talking, no attempt at liberalism, and just come right down the middle and try to work out ideas about separation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. That right there. You have somebody who's telling you, I don't want you to marry my women. It's once you feel the same way. Africa for Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So the only people who can meet with be someone who has the same mentality for their people. Whites for whites, blacks for blacks. So that's why they had to do. That was the first time something like that happened.
That's so important. I heard somebody say my favorite type of white person is an upfront racist white person. Let me know who you are. Let me know what you're about. Let me see exactly what it is that I'm dealing with. I don't want nobody who's gonna be nice to me in my face and then undercut me behind my back. I don't want that, right? And so very similar to what you're saying, Garvey is saying, I believe that we should be out of here. I believe that black people should go back to Africa. And guess who else believe that? They want us to go back too. So let's work together to figure out a way to get us back. That's what he's saying, right? So yes. This is cool. Oh, this is good. Okay, so my brother here just bought, is it okay if I pass this around? Yeah. So my brother here just bought a certificate of the Black Star Line we were talking about. So what Garvey had people doing was they would take $5, right? The members of the UNIA, anybody, would take $5 and they would buy stock in the Black Star Line, right? They were buying stock in his company. And then he would use that to help build the company and get these boats to take black folks back to Africa. Again, a genius idea because the stock market was fairly new at the time. And so he understood how to use capitalism to his advantage and to use capitalism to help free black people. And so what's getting passed around now is just an example of the stock certificate that you would get when you paid your $5 and you would buy stock in the Black Star Line that would eventually, that was supposed to take us back. I've heard, oh, that came out way before I was born, but I've heard it. Mm. Oh, really? With the Klan. Mm.
I remember my mother talking to some of her friends back in '68.
Mm.
Who are you going to vote for president? Nixon was running.
Mm-hmm.
Hubert Humphrey was running. George Wallace, I think, was running.
Mm.
And so she was saying, for all intents and purposes, I'm kind of leaning toward George Wallace. And they were all speaking out. Why would you do that?
Yeah.
And don't you understand that? She said, I'm from Alabama. I grew up there. I know what it's about. But said, I'm thinking about it. But at least with George Wallace, I know what I'm getting.
Right.
So, that is stuck with me all.
Yeah, I mean, if regardless of whether I agree or disagree with your method of trying to get rid of my people, you and I both don't want us to be here. So let's figure out a way to come to some kind of agreement so that we can get out of here. Now, Du Bois was one of the people that capitalized on this because he was trying to diminish Garvey's power and influence as much as possible because he felt that Garvey was a threat, not only to his ideas, but to what he believed would be the ultimate freedom and liberation for Black people. And so because of that, once he found out that Garvey met with the Klan, he began to blow this up, right, all over. And we're going to talk about Du Bois and the Harlem Renaissance in a second. But he began to blow this up in The Crisis, his magazine. He began to blow this up in The Crisis, his magazine. And he talked about how harmful Garvey was to his followers, how harmful Garvey was to the Black nation. So, in addition, red, black, and green. Much of what, Juneteenth, Black History Month, you see all of us wearing our red, black, and green, or people having the red, black, and green flag. And many people don't know that that was created by Marcus Garvey, right? When we celebrated Kwanzaa, and you have the red candles, the black candle in the middle, and the green candles, that was the red, black, and green, and the symbolism for red, black, and green was created by Marcus Garvey. And that was what, and what kind of flag did they call that? The Pan-African flag. Pan-African flag. Again, Africa for the Africans. And when he's saying Africans, he's saying all of us. At home, that's what he said, at home and abroad, right? And so, and the red in the Pan-African flag stands for what? For the blood that was shed, right? For the blood that was shed not only on the continent, but also during the transatlantic slave trade. What does the green stand for? The land, the wealth that he's saying we have to benefit from, and not have anybody else dictate what happens with the land that belongs to our home. And then what does the black stand for? Skin, the people, right? The people, the sacrifice, and the wealth and the land from our people, right? And so these colors he created because he believed, he said, every single nation has a flag but us. That's what he said. Yes, where's the black man's king? Where's the black man's military? Where's the black man's flag? He saw a void, and this is what I want to reinforce. Because when we talk about history, we're also talking about how do we learn today. And out of all of the people, I think Garvey is one of those leaders and people that when he saw a void, instead of just complaining, he did something about it. Did it always work? No. This Black Star Line eventually went down. The boats left New York, and I don't think it made it a few miles before they started to sink, and they had to bring the people back. So he didn't always think it all the way through, but he was always trying to do something. When he saw a void, he always tried to fix it, right? I saw a hand. Oh, yes.
Was there more than one flag created, or was the one I had in mind? I think it was red, black, and green, but it had some type of symbol in the middle of it. I don't know if that was.
I said, I don't know. I don't. A Native African. And so that's what I was thinking, because there are a couple of flags that have the red, black, and green. I think Kenya's flag is red, black, and green. There's a couple of flags that are red, black, and green, but then they may have other symbols, or it may be laid out differently. So it could be that. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about how he was indicted on mail fraud. He was convicted. He had his appeal denied. Let's see. Oh, so as we continue to move forward, we'll talk about this more later. But Marcus Garvey eventually was locked up again, basically for tax purposes, right? For not paying taxes on these businesses that he had. So again, they were doing everything they could to lock him up because he wasn't doing anything wrong or illegal, but they had to get him on something. Finally, they got him on mail fraud again, mainly taxes, and he was eventually put in prison in Atlanta. And then what a lot of people don't know is that when he was put in prison in Atlanta, the president, I forgot who the president was, Calvin Coolidge, I believe. The president at that time eventually let him out and took him to New Orleans, where he was deported back to Jamaica. But guess who wrote the letter, which was probably one of many letters that was used to get him out of prison? No, Du Bois was happy he was in. Du Bois was like, lock him up, leave him in there. But guess who wrote the letter that eventually got him out? Malcolm X's father. Malcolm X's daddy, Earl Little, was one, because he was a Garveyite. He was a Garveyite, and he wrote the letter. And right after he wrote that letter, eventually, again, don't quote me on the president. Can't remember the exact one, but the president of the United States let him out, but on the condition that he be deported back to Jamaica, right? So his movement was no small movement, and he had believers, and he had followers, and he had supporters that backed him up, and they had enough power to even influence the president of the United States. So eventually, he began to teach School of African Philosophy in 1937. He had a cerebral hemorrhage in January of 1940, and he later died. I believe he was in his 50s in 1940 in London. So just a little bit about Marcus Garvey. A lot of his peak and most influential times was when he was in Harlem, and he tried to kind of recreate it when he went to Toronto and when he went to London, but it wasn't as powerful and it wasn't as influential as it was when he was in Harlem. But one of the things he said before he left, when he was in New Orleans, before he went back to Jamaica, there was a famous saying. Does anybody know his famous saying? Okay, that was one. It was look, but it's look for what? Look for me in the whirlwind. And does anybody know what that means? Look for me in the whirlwind. The spirit of him lingering, not just for the ancestors, but he's basically saying, you can get rid of me, and maybe he could feel that his time was coming to an end, but he's saying, I have so many more people that's coming after me. Fred Hampton said, you can kill a what? You can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill a revolution. He's saying, I got so many more people coming. So when he said, look for me in the whirlwind, he said, look for me in the things that's to come. And that's exactly what happened. Because shortly after his kind of reign came to an end, you had the rise of the Nation of Islam. You had the rise of black nationalism, or the continuance of black nationalism. And then in the 1940s was really when the civil rights movement started and then began to really take shape with the Montgomery bus boycott. The 1950s and 60s, a lot of this was based off of Garvey's ideas and philosophies. So when he say, look for me in the whirlwind, he's saying, just because you're killing me, these ideas are going to live on. And it still lives today in our Black Power movement, in hip hop, in Black Lives Matter. All of these things are based off of what Garvey was teaching during that time. The 5% Nation, right? All of these ideas and organizations and movements were based off of that. So I just had a couple of pictures that I wanted to show. The Negro Factories. This was a newspaper clipping that he would have in his newspapers of the Negro world. Build factories, operate factories, and what does that say? Control your own destiny. That's what he was all about, controlling your own destiny, doing for self, right? Just like what we're doing here. We're not going to wait on our schools to teach our history. We're going to teach and learn ourselves in our own institutions. Tailored hats of artistic design, Black-owned tailors, Black-owned clothing stores, a Black-owned trucking company, the UNIA Truck Quick Delivery Trucking Company. This Universal Negro Improvement Association borrowing $2 million from, what does that say? Its own members. We don't have to go to the white man. We don't have to go to the government. We don't have to go to Rockefeller, right? Who was one of the, I believe it was Rockefeller, who was one of the ones that wrote the check for Tuskegee, right? And he's saying, cool, but we want to get loans from our own people. We want to build up our own people to start building a nation for the Negro people of the world, okay? I thought this was very significant because Garvey had an 8-point program. Who knows who had a 10-point program? The Black Panther Party, right? Various movements had these point programs. These are the themes, these are the concepts that we live by, right? As a group, as an organization, to champion Black nationhood by the redemption of Africa, to make the Black race conscious, to breathe ideals of manhood and womanhood in every Black person, to advocate self-determination, to man the Black man world conscious, to print all the news that will be interesting and instructive to the Black man, to instill racial self-help, to inspire racial love and self-respect. Religiously, the UNIA founded also the African Orthodox Church in New York in 1921. So now the UNIA was not necessarily a religious movement, right? They took on, it didn't matter what your religious ideologies were, right? But they also understood the significance of Christianity. And most of black people at that time, and same way now, are either Christian or came out of Christian ideas. So he understood that and said, well, you know what? Since that's the case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to utilize that Christianity and infuse African fundamentalism, self-determination into these Christian ideas and create our own church. Absolutely, absolutely. And so he said, if we're going to have our own church is going to canonize our own disciples and our own saviors and our own images of what God looked like. And so this is where you get the image of the Black God and the Black Jesus, etc., right? Another group that was very much influenced by the Garvey movement was the Rastafarians. The Rastafarian viewpoint. Marcus was the patriarch, Messiah of the Rastafarian tradition, the spiritual seer to whom was revealed the route along which African people needed to trod in order to escape their terrible bondage. So, and who's probably the most popular Rastafarian that we know? Bob Marley's the most, he's the most popular. Haile Selassie, yes, he is the leader, if you will. But yeah, Bob Marley's the most popular one, right, that we would know. And so Marcus Garvey shaped the thinking of 20th century Black minds. Tafari Makonnen, who we would later call His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. Selassie was more the embodiment of the Rastafarian faith. Not that he necessarily adopted Garveyism himself, because actually, if I'm not mistaken, there was some dissension between Garvey and the leaders of Ethiopia, and Garvey and Tafari, right? So there was some dissension there. So I'm not suggesting that they worked together, but what Emperor Haile Selassie was building and creating through his movement, much of that was largely inspired by what Garvey was teaching and doing right here in the United States. The original rosters drew their inspiration from Marcus Garvey. Rastafari Makonnen was crowned the new emperor of Ethiopia, and upon his coronation, he claimed for himself that his title was part of the powerful Trinity. And this announcement was a monumental event that many Blacks in Africa and the Americas attributed to Garvey's philosophies. November 2nd, 1930. So this was when he wasn't even in America at that time. I think he was in London at that time, right? And his meetings were all over. He had meetings in any church that would allow him, right? One of his biggest meetings was in Atlanta, Georgia, in the at Big Bethel AME Church, right? So he held meetings all over, right? I always like to do this as well when we're talking about history, is also make this history poignant to where we are here in Jacksonville. Because a lot of times we don't know how much Jacksonville has contributed to the larger Black history, and we don't know how much history has passed through the city of Jacksonville. Has anybody ever heard of Mother Kofi? Watch this. Mother Kofi was a woman. She was born in Accra, Ghana, right? And it's likely that she was born into a royal family, right? Early in her life, she had these visions, kind of like Harriet Tubman, but had these visions. Now we know with Harriet Tubman, she was hit in the head with an iron, right? So it's likely that there was something wrong biologically, but she would have these visions. And very similar, Mother Kofi would have these visions of her going abroad and teaching African Black people worldwide, teaching them about themselves, teaching them who they are and where they come from. So eventually she left Ghana and she moved to Detroit, and she began to work for Marcus Garvey. She began to work for the UNIA, right? And while she was working for the UNIA, she was so powerful, she was so influential and such an amazing speaker that even though she worked for Garvey, people kind of started wanting to follow her. They wanted to know what she thought. Very similar to how people felt Malcolm X was doing with the Nation of Islam, that thought that he was bigger than the program, and he didn't feel that way, but people was putting out that idea. Same thing with Mother Kofi. She worked for Marcus Garvey in the Universal Negro Improvement Association, but she decided to use Jacksonville, Florida as her base. So her base out of her movement was in Jacksonville, and her followers went into the thousands. 10, 15, 20,000 people would follow her and go to her wherever she would go and she was teaching. And her base was right here in Jacksonville. She founded what was called the African Universal Church, and she decided that she was, and so Garvey saw what she was doing, and he got jealous, right? He got jealous. Ain't no way this Black woman, not a Black, just a woman in general, is going to gain more followers and gain more attention and momentum than me. She worked for me. So he got upset. He was upset. He was jealous, right? And we know sexism and patriarchy is deep in our history, right? So we got to acknowledge that. So he got upset, and he said that she was building too much of a following. he said, this woman is a fake and has no authority for me to speak. So he separated himself from Mother Kofi. She was cool, so she kept doing what she was doing. Eventually, in March, the year later, March 1928, she was doing a big presentation in Miami. She was speaking and it was full, thousands of people at a church in Miami. Well, one of the people in the church was a Garveyite. Not just any Garveyite, but a crazy Garveyite, right? And so they pulled up, I think it was two people, pulled up to the church and they shot her. They shot her in the head and she died. His name was Mark, one of the assailants was Maxwell Crook, and he was immediately beaten to death by the people once they caught up with him. Tens of thousands of people were said to have attended her funeral in several cities, dressed in red, black, and green. And there was a place in a bronze casket, and it's actually entombed in Jacksonville's Old City Cemetery, right? So this woman, and I was actually put on, I wasn't told everything, but I was put onto this story by some of my colleagues at the Jacksonville Historical Society, right? It was actually a white dude that told me about her. And I was like, what? He just kind of mentioned it, and I was like, put it in my phone, like, let me look this up later. And I found out that this sister was a very powerful UNIA member who chose to use Jacksonville as her base. It says the Old City Cemetery here in Jacksonville. Okay. Now, I also want to say this as well. There's no proof of this. I don't think that Marcus Garvey put the hit out to have her killed, but I believe that, with every religion, with every organization, you have people that go rogue. You have people that believe in the leaders so much that they would do anything. And that's why leaders have to be very careful about what they say, because you can say certain things and cause riots, cause people to, kill other people in the name of the movement. So I don't think he said it out, but these people were so much in love with Marcus Garvey that they killed Mother Kofi. Okay. And this was one of the things we was talking about earlier, where Marcus Garvey was his first assassination attempt. So, okay, real quick before we go into the Harlem Renaissance, some of the weaknesses of the Garvey movement. The Garvey movement failed. While I don't argue that that there were weaknesses, I do believe that that it failed, because I do believe that there were other movements that came out of it. I do believe some of the things that led to how significant it was at the time were that, number one, he was convicted of mail fraud and he was sent to prison. And so because he was seen as the kind of messianic leader of the UNIA, that definitely put a pause on some of its influence and power. He also wanted to move the headquarters to Jamaica. So when he was deported back to Jamaica, him and many of the other leaders in the UNIA argued about whether the headquarters should stay in Harlem or whether it should go to Jamaica. And so that was part of the reason why it weakened. It was also in many ways disorganized. So it was disorganized because leaders were arguing with each other. And then in January 1940, he got sick, and eventually he passed away. And Garvey he actually was heralded as Jamaica's first national hero. So Garvey is still very important today. One of the things I wanted to ask before we go into the next topic, because I always like to have a discussion question, is one of the things that he pushed for was this idea of functional unity. And he said that all we need be is black. Irrespective of ideologies, disastrously failed in the UNIA. Each UNIA chapter would function autonomously, going wherever it chooses. And this eventually led to the splintering off into other organizations and factions. So you think that this is another weakness in the Black community currently? This idea of not recognizing the differences that can exist even among us as Black people. How? Mm-hmm.
Not only associated with common refrigerator,
Mm-hmm.
that you have to stand behind, your own, and part of a common interest. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why, like you said earlier, that's why this organization was so successful, because it has so many different groups and religious organizations to overlook it. Whereas you might have like denominations in like Christianity, Islam, whatever, and they have to stay. They usually stay and socialize within their sect, and they don't want, they either don't want to or scared to go out this set or just bias. So, yeah, it's a detriment.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Absolutely correct.
Mm-hmm.
I was having a discussion with someone with my mother. And what we were discussing was that before you're Baptist, Jehovah's Witness, Seventh-day Adventist, you're black. And black people have to really get that in our head, because believe it or not, everybody else, I go to sort of Southeast Asian markets. Southeast Asia is big. It's different countries. They're not saying, oh, you're from Laos, you're from Thailand, you're from the Philippines. They all know the Asian. You know what I mean? And even in Kenya, or Egypt, a guy's, he might be a priest of Amun-Ra. His wife is the priestess of Set or Isis. So even though the way we look at it, religion would have been different. They all had a common goal, and that's very true. And you can't separate. Oh, he's well, not like how they do in the streets. Rap music. So a lot of times, when you get older, you're looking at it like, well, the kids doing this. Well, the adults get it too. The adults get it. Christian loves. You know, same identity, one on one. So we have to get that in our head that no matter the label, you know what I mean? Because we don't consider anybody our enemies, but we do have enemies. And our enemies look at all of us as the exact same.
When have we ever spoken with one voice?
Okay.
We never have. So I don't know why we're expecting us to come together and unify when, in my opinion, we have never had one voice. We've never been monolithic. So having come from various tribes, and I go back to Africa, because even the African chiefs were complicit in the slave trade. So that being the case, you had all languages, all tribes on the ship coming to America. But we did unify because we had to survive.
Yeah.
Even Harriet Tubman couldn't get everybody on board.
True.
She had to leave some folks.
True. Yeah.
They didn't believe in leaving where they were. They didn't believe in their comfort, leaving their comfort. So my question is it a pipe dream that we will ever have unity among us?
That's a good point. That's a good point. I saw his hand, and I'm gonna come to you. Yeah. I saw you, and I'll come to you.
I think we need to try to create unity based upon just the concept of skin color. I think it needs to be ethno-racial plus culture at the same time. Now, having said that, I do believe that functional unity has been a problem. I do think that what I would call an Ubuntu model, which promotes dialogue, networking, teamwork for development, also accommodates the idea that differences and diversity can be made into strength. So similarities, obviously, are coalition, but we also should work to look at varied opinions as being centers of strengths also to accommodate being non-monolithic at the same time.
I can see that, yeah.
And maybe we don't have to go out maybe with the bathwater. We can take what works and tweak that to include multiple ideas, as long as we can come up with maybe common goals and realize that there are people who might actually have common goals but different ways to get there. Some people may not have exactly the same common goals, but we can utilize them.
So we can find the benefits of our respective ideologies. There could be some benefits there. Okay, I like that.
The MAGA government, the white nationalists, the white who are outright Klansmen, and the evangelical community may all say that they are different. They may all promote whiteness, but regardless of their different slants and apparent frictions even between themselves, they all find themselves in the same room when it comes to whiteness.
Good point.
There will never be this utopia or imagined perfection of every black person thinking or being on the same thing. You have to plug into innate or inborn nature to come together in common interest when it's something that is going to set us back, maybe even kill us as a collective, as a group of people. And a good example of that now, to me, that I see, is a lot of the black matter that you come up against. Like, as they black matter, and they pretty much go too finale against their own interests of the collective and in support of proximity to whiteness or European power.
Yeah, somebody else had their hand raised. Oh, okay. I'll go to you, and then I'll come over to you.
And if we keep the main thing, then it's possible to have unity, but unity in that thing. You're not ever going to get all of these people that come from different backgrounds, to agree on everything.
Right.
That's not even possible. Okay? But if we keep the things that we do agree on and highlight those things, like the brother was saying here, you know, the other races, man, they fight, they argue, but you don't hear about it. So when we have dissension amongst ourselves, it's like it's broadcast all over. You know, when we running here, making our own thing, doing our own thing, you know, why not stay? Why not use those, like this everybody said, why not use those things, our differences, to build on, you know, to build us up instead of dividing us. We're so quick to run off.
Black MAGA. Black MAGA is trying to join them. The groups that I mentioned, the different white groups, they're not trying to join us. They're trying to divide the power themselves.
I just came from a Malcolm X grassroots movement media before I came here, and that was one of the points that was brought up is that we, as a people, if you're a strong person individually, you shouldn't be a leader. I think that stifles a lot of movements, like for
you don't do that work yourself. You're kind of just looking for somebody to do the work for you. And I think that if we all kind of just look for the one common goal of the survival of our people, like if you look at Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, they may have disagreed on a lot, but in the end, they wanted the same thing.
Right.
And they were probably, well, they did agree on a lot more than they did disagree.
True. Absolutely.
Yeah, we have to embrace our own diversity, one. And then two, we have to remember that, ever since we've been here, the plan has been to keep seeds of division within us. And it's almost become like a DNA factor.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. For instance, we've been talking about the MAGA thing going back and forth. I'm sitting up here and I watch a lot of sports. I see a sports reporter using in various outlets to say, well, if black folk would just vote Republican, silent.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
I ain't calling them names.
I will, Stephen A. Smith. Right, I can't stand him. Right.
I'm sitting up here, I'm like, man, I don't even watch predictions when it comes to basketball. But like I said, the seeds of dissension has always been sown into us by the system more than other groups. Like this gentleman was saying about the Asian community, you can almost say the same thing about the Latin community. You can hear from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Honduras, Colombia, Venezuela, whatever. But when there's a Latin something, they find a way to find a common ground, even though these are all different countries, slightly different cultures. So we have to learn to embrace our own diversity.
And I wanted to say that to say that again, it's okay if we have our own diversity. It's okay if we have our own thoughts, because we are gonna have our own opinion, our own religious organizations, our own ethnicities or whatever. But those things that are important and that affect all of us, that we can find common ground on, we want to find that common ground on that, but then also appreciate the diversity. Like Brother Baruti was saying, appreciate and find strengths in that diversity, right? So we got about, I think about 30 more minutes, maybe 40, 30 more minutes. So I want to touch on what else was going on during this time of the 1920s, very similar as part of the backdrop of the Garvey movement, and that was the Harlem Renaissance. And I'm sure you've heard about it. You may know a lot about it, you may know a little bit about it, but I kind of want to talk about it from a different perspective. And much of this is based off of a documentary that I got a lot of this information from called Against All Odds. So, I think that's the name of it, Against All Odds. I think it's very old. It may have come out in like the 80s. I'm sorry I said that was very old, but in comparison to kids now, it seems old. I was born in the 80s, but yeah, so it came out, I believe, back then, and it's called, I believe it's called Against All Odds. So what I think is important when we talk about, this is where I was getting at earlier, and I was kind of jumping ahead of myself, was the reason why Garvey's movement was so significant was because we have to look at what was happening in the larger culture during this time, right? During this time, there was a stereotype about Black people, right? And it really went back to the late 1800s. And Du Bois, and what he, not the Atlanta Exposition, he created this African-American art and picture display that ended up being worldwide. And he took these ideas and brought it to the Americas because he wanted to offset the stereotypes that were put out about Black people during this time. Black art was struggling during the 1920s because of the stereotypes of what Black people could be. When you looked on, it wasn't television, but when you looked in art, when you looked in culture, when you looked in books and magazines and newspapers, the only thing that we could see that we were able to accomplish was being a janitor or so cooking, cleaning, entertaining, But that was all of what we were told we could do. We weren't ever told we could create or we could build or when we saw art in museums or when we saw art in people's houses, there was Picasso, right? It was art by all of these white Europeans, and there was no reflection of who we were. So we didn't even conceive, especially children, couldn't even conceive that we could actually create these things. And then even art schools wouldn't accept Black people. So those very talented young Black boys and young Black girls who could draw and who could paint and who could sculpt, they couldn't even go to art school because the art schools wouldn't accept them. And when they got in and they graduated, they couldn't find work. They couldn't find work and nobody would buy their work, right? There was a foundation by William E. Harlem that was one of the few white foundations that provided opportunities for Black people. And out of these foundations and out of these movements and initiatives, there were people that paid attention to these Black artists who came through the William E. Harmon Foundation and other foundations, many of them that were founded by white people. And these art images that we created were important because they were different from the stereotypes in the national consciousness. So what was seen in the mainstream were images like this, images of the mammy, images of extremely dark, goofy, unintelligent buffoons, right? And this is what we were told that we were. And even though we as Black people knew that we were different, and even though we as Black people knew that there were doctors and there were teachers and there were intelligent people, and even if there were janitors or our mothers or fathers who would take care of kids or who would do what would be considered common or menial work, it didn't mean that they were dumb. It didn't mean that they were unintelligent. They were smart. They were creative. They were cultured. But we knew it, but there was no way for the rest of the country to know it because there was no mainstream way in which this was shown. Does anybody know where this scene is from? A movie. Anybody know who that is right there? Damon Wayans. Y'all know what movie this is from? Bamboozle, right? Bamboozle came out in 2000, I believe, 2001 with Damon Wayans. It was a Spike Lee film that talks about that era of Black art, right? The blackface era, okay? And one of the larger mainstream displays that really perpetuated these negative stereotypes about Black people was a movie called The Birth of a Nation. And Birth of a Nation was a movie that essentially rewrote Reconstruction, right? Reconstruction went one way. Birth of a Nation was the white perspective of what was happening during Reconstruction. And it was seen as the cinematic masterpiece, but really it just displayed the so-called superiority of the white race. And it really provided a cinematic foundation or a cinematic buttressing of what was already taught about who we were. We were already taught in science that our brains were smaller, that our heads were smaller, that we were less intelligent, that we came from jungles, that we came from the jungles of Africa, that we came from monkeys, right? That this was who we were, right? And so the Birth of a Nation was just a kind of a cinematic way to kind of provide a foundation for the scientific racism that was already happening during that time.
That movie also allowed the president of the United States at that time, Woodrow Wilson, to rubber stamp bigotry as he had a private showing at the White House.
Absolutely.
What a great movie this was.
Sure.
The center of that movie was white man, blackface, supposed to be a brother, who saw this white woman with bananas. Oh no, we can't have that. So now you have the men of the community, and now we wouldn't have it today where men would put on masks and go after that. So the men in the mask in the hood saved the community.
And that led to the rebirth. Yes, and that led to the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. Because the Klan had kind of fell by the wayside by then. It wasn't really as popular. And when this movie came out, they had a second wave of the Klan. Right, especially in Indiana was one of the worst places, and the rebirth of the Klan happened in Atlanta, in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Right, that was where it kind of rebirthed, but it was largely due to this movie. Lynching parties terrorized the South. In the Midwest, federal protections were rolled back, and then we had menial jobs. So this was the life that Black people were living in during this time, right? And so, because of that, we decided, when we talked about this earlier, we want to get out of here. We want to find better opportunities for ourselves, for our family, for our children. So we participated in this great migration. And we began to move to Chicago and Harlem and Cleveland and in these places up north. And so, as hundreds of thousands of immigrants were coming into the country, Black people, while Black people are moving so-called backwards, because this is how we're displayed as monkeys and buffoons, and we can't do anything more than be janitors, you have these white immigrants coming into the country and they're moving forward. They're starting businesses, they're getting jobs, they're going to school, they're getting an education. And so there's this idea that, well, if these white immigrants are coming to the country and not knowing the language and not knowing anything, and they're getting jobs and they're getting opportunities, well, what's wrong with these Black folks that's been here this whole time? And why can't they get it together? Why can't they work hard enough to be successful? Maybe it's because they are naturally inferior. And so, because of these ideas, the elite Black people, the NAACP, Du Bois, the educated leaders of the Black nation decided we want to show a different Black man. We want to show a different Black woman. We want to show a different Black family. And so that's why even when you Google this time period, you see these images of an upstanding Black man with his Black wife and his Black children, to show that we are more than just what we saw in that other picture. That we're more than just, that we're not these people that were being displayed in the Birth of a Nation movement, movie. So we talked about this before, but during the Great Migration, Black people were recruited to the factory jobs because white guys were across in Europe fighting World War I, right? So when Black people came back from the war, some Black people were fighting in the war. When they came back to the war, they were heroes. Also, when Black people got these factory jobs, they were getting paid way more than they were as sharecroppers in the South. And so Black people now are starting to make a little money. And when we got our money, we started to buy homes. But we weren't necessarily buying homes in Black neighborhoods. We were buying homes where? In white neighborhoods, right? We were buying homes in white neighborhoods. Around the same time, Black soldiers are coming back home and they're heroes. Also, they have the money to also move into white neighborhoods. Remember I told y'all about those long, big marches that they would have whenever the soldiers were coming back to war? Black soldiers were a part of that. And so now we look like we mean something. We have dignity. We have Americans throwing parades, not really for us, but we're a part of these parades that they're throwing in these big cities. We have a little bit of money from working in these factories, and now we can buy a car. Now we can move into neighborhoods. And so now we kind of feel like we're actually moving up. But white folks ain't like that. White folks wanted us to stay in our place. And so we had something called the Red Summer of 1919. What was the Red Summer? Race, all over the country, there were race riots all over the country, right? And it was called the Red Summer. That name was given by James Weldon Johnson, right? Who gave it the Red Summer. And white people attacked Black folks in various cities across the nation. And so Black people began to organize. And through the NAACP and through the Urban League, we began to fight back. right? So, and they call it race riots, but really it was racialized attacks from white people onto black people, and black people began to defend themselves. And so Du Bois and his team sat back and they said, okay, how can we fix this? What can we, even though it wasn't our problem to fix, right? But what can we do in response to this, right? What is the answer to how they feel about us? And the conclusion they came to was that we need to recreate the image of the Negro. We need to show them a better black man, show them a better black woman, show them that we have culture, show them who we are, show them that we can think and behave and create art and poetry and music just like them. And maybe if they see all the goodness that exists in our culture and in our community, maybe we'll be treated better. Maybe they won't feel the need to attack us. Maybe they won't feel threatened, right? And so this was kind of one of the bases of the Harlem Renaissance. You think that was a good strategy? that don't really sit well with you. Why not?
Together with somebody who's already civilized.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who made up something about being civilized.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're going to try to Europeanize ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? That's really what happened.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to Europeanize ourselves. To fit, my hair a little nap, every time put the lion and the things and sneak it back. You know what I'm saying? Maybe they'll like, they didn't see what happened during that time.
Mm-hmm.
When they played in the clubs, we had to go into the back. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Mm-hmm.
That was a good idea.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. It was this idea, and again, this kind of goes back to Du Bois's idea of, and he eventually thought himself out of it. Eventually, he was like, "We're trying everything to appeal to them, and it's not working. It's not working." And you would think that he would have remembered this from I believe it was the 1906 race riots in Atlanta. But it took him some decades before he even realized we can't behave our way out of racism. And this is what Marcus Garvey was really trying to say the whole time. He was saying this, and Du Bois felt like, well, if we start a movement where if we create poems and art and stories and a display to show our dignity and to show our self-respect, maybe this can work. And while it didn't help in terms of the racism, what it did do, right, was it started this artistic movement that still influences us today, that has influenced our music and our culture and our food and our dance. And it gave a platform for people like Zora Neale Hurston, for people like Josephine Baker, and many other people to not only make money, to not only showcase their identity, but also to take these ideas, right, and then Africanize them. So you were talking about some of these ways were ways in which we kind of felt like we needed to be more Europeanized, but also within the Harlem Renaissance, we said, but within this movement, we're going to do the same thing that we're doing, but we're going to use African influence. We're going to look back to Africa. So in some ways, they even adopted Garvey's idea, and we're going to talk about that in a second, of looking back to Africa to inspire the colors in our art. We're going to look to Africa and look to Black American history to inspire our poetry, to inspire our music.
That's what I want to say. I do think that it's important for a people to always build culture from within, how people look at themselves to each other.
Mm-hmm.
I have residual effects about how you're seen by others, yes, but you always want to display inner dignity from the origins of one's own culture.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to point out that, and I'm sure everybody's aware of it, Marcus Garvey was quite an excellent poet.
Mm-hmm.
And wrote many very, very extensive poems. And so these poems like 2 pages long. Excellent. I think one of them is called The Mother.
Mm-hmm.
But he was quite an accomplished poet.
Yeah. Absolutely. Poet, writer, and that's another thing. Many of these early black leaders were very diverse, were multi-hyphenated individuals, right? Um, um, Now, as we know, and we know this even today, black culture is always a hot commodity, right? Our culture, our identity, the way we do music, the way we speak, right? It's still to this day the most imitated culture in the world, including African culture, right? I remember I was over in the Netherlands and I was talking to some Nigerians and they were saying, listen, everybody want to be like African Americans. African American culture, that is your export. And African American people need to own and need to control and benefit from black culture because no matter who you are, whether you white, black, Asian, Latin, African American culture is still probably one of its most valuable exports and resources, right? And that's exactly what it was during the Harlem Renaissance. They loved what was going on down in Black Harlem. And while they didn't want to live next to us, or while they didn't want our kids to go to the same school as them, they didn't mind coming down and listening to that, what they call jungle music, dancing to the jungle music, coming down to the clubs, getting the food, hearing the art, hearing the poetry, hearing the readings from County Cullen at the library, or the poetry from Paul Robeson, or some of the art made by Augusta Savage, who's actually right here from Jacksonville, or Green Cove Springs, right? So these are things that white people love, and it was a hot commodity then, it's a hot commodity now, and they invested. Because of course they just want to make money. So they invested in the black entertainment so they could make money off of our art, right? So, and essentially that's what happened with the New Negro movement. And so that's how you get the Harlem Renaissance. That's how you get the music, the jazz that really came from New Orleans and made its way up into the Midwest and the North. Mm-hmm. Yes. That came out in the 20s. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yes. Our scholars. Carter G. Woodson is often overlooked when we talk about these scholars of Booker T. Washington and Du Bois. And I would even mention Garvey and Carter G. Woodson as well. Absolutely. I wanted to include this photo, even though this photo I think was taken in the 40s, I believe. A Great Day in Harlem. I included this because many of the early Harlem Renaissance jazz artists were in this photo, and then they actually redid this photo in the 90s, but with hip hop artists. And I think it was like 50 years later, so it was like 1997 or 98, and they had hip hop artists, and they redid A Great Day in Harlem. Yeah. Oh, really? Oh, what? He was the last, so he was probably one of the kids. Oh, really? He was the last one. Wow. Yeah, so I wanted to put this picture up here, and you can't really see it, but Langston Hughes is in it, I believe, Ella Fitzgerald, and many other people. Yeah.
Over in France, because during World War I, outside of being indigenous and serving in the child line, the thought was, we don't want Negroes learning how to use military grade weapons.
That's right.
Well, let them fight with the French, they don't need to be with us. So during the downtime, brothers were playing the jazz and the ragtime and doing some dances, and the French soldiers were eating it up. There's a documentary that runs. I'm trying to remember the exact name of it. It may be the Harlem Hellfighters.
Harlem Hellfighters. I never heard of that. Okay. Mm. Mm. Well, France has always had, not always, but France has, for well over 100 years, has had, I guess you could say, an appreciation for African American culture, and it was there that Du Bois did that. I think it was in the 1890s, did that huge display of the dignity of Black American families and people, and then brought that to the United States. But Paris has always loved Black American culture. It was our African brothers and sisters that they've always, been that have been marginalized and murdered, and even up to today. Yeah, even up to today. So you can see these just different images of people: Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, who were significant contributors to the Harlem Renaissance. All right, and then of course W.E.B. Du Bois, who would, some people may even consider him and Alain Locke the masterminds behind this whole movement. And so essentially, white patrons, right, white benefactors and white people with money had the cash, and they demanded art. And this was what really kind of set the stage for the Harlem Renaissance. Black leaders allied with wealthy whites to create this black art. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about, to kind of go back to what we were talking about with Garvey, was that Alain Locke, who was one of the intellectual leaders of the Harlem Renaissance, him and Du Bois disagreed, because Du Bois felt like everything that we do should be to advance the race. Everything that we do should be to uplift Black people. Your art, your poetry, your music, it should be conscious. It should be advancing us. It should be showing us in a different light and in a better light. And Alain Locke said, but sometimes we don't be feeling like talking about that all the time. Like, sometimes you just want to create just to create. You don't want to have to be Black all day, every day. You know what I mean? We just want to let the artists be artists, right? You know what I'm saying? Let the artists be artists. Maybe one day they woke up and they girlfriend broke up with them, or they husband left them, and they want to talk about that, right? They don't always have to be so political. And so they disagreed with that, because Du Bois had this larger agenda of, we need to take our people to a better level. And Alain Locke believed in that too, right? He didn't disagree, but he also felt like there should be a balance between, this political agenda and then just letting artists kind of do their thing.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? So you brought up on the screen here Picasso and Matisse.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Andre
Matisse, yeah.
that were influenced by African art.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to point out, if people aren't aware, that you can look up a font right now called
Matisse.
ITC. Matisse ITC. And the font is used now, but it was a font that was created in kind of a tribute to Matisse's appreciation of African art.
Mm.
So when you look at the font in terms of the way the lettering, the style, it harks back to some aspects of Cubism, as Matisse and Picasso were into, but the idea of using what became stereotypical African shapes and contours as part of the writing. So you just look up Matisse ITC as one of the fonts. Actually, it might be one of the Microsoft fonts.
Yeah, that's the first time I've seen it was in the Microsoft. Yeah.
Maybe 15 years ago.
Yeah. And this is what I was talking about earlier with Africa being for the Africans. This is what. So again, there's overlap to what Du Bois and Garvey is saying, but sometimes they were so caught up in their differences that they didn't really see they were actually agreeing in some ways. because Garvey is saying Africa for the Africans, the actual land and the wealth and the culture. But Du Bois is saying the same thing with the art, right? You have Picasso and you have Matisse, you have all of these European artists that are inspired by African people, and not only inspired by African art, but then they're using it and making money off of it. And Du Bois and Alain Locke are saying, who has more legitimacy to African art than African people? And African people worldwide. So we should be the ones that be inspired by our art and our culture and our people and the way in which we do poetry and the way in which we do music. We should be the ones to be inspired by it, create it, and then own it and make money off of it, right? So these were some of the things that were discussed and talked about within during the Harlem Renaissance. So we're actually wrapping up. We have about 5 more minutes. But again, in discussing this and talking about diversity, right? Yes, there was a diversity in the Black agenda of the Harlem Renaissance, whether it should just be for the creation of good art or whether it should be for political. You have Black artists. Some Black artists did look to the past. You had your Claude McKays, right? You had your James Weldon Johnsons. But you had some Black artists that say, you know what? I don't really want to look to Africa. I just want to create, right? That's not really my thing. I don't identify with Africa because I've never been, right? I just know what I know here. And that's the diversity, right? In Black thought, we all don't think the same. So some studied under European styles. Some didn't want to limit themselves to just being a Black artist. There's research and there's letters where many of the Harlem Renaissance artists didn't want to be called Black artists. They just wanted to be artists. They felt it was limiting, right? And do you think we see this in our artists and entertainers today? Right? I've heard some actors and actresses, they say, I don't want to be a Black actor. I just want to be an actor, right? But then you have other people like Lauryn Hill who said, no, I make my music for Black people. This is for this particular group. Now, anybody else who want to buy it, I'm not going to stop you. If you like it, you want to buy it, you want to come to my concert, cool. But I am a Black artist for Black people. So there are these different perspectives, right? People have, and it goes all the way back to that time. So Du Bois talks about this in Souls of Black Folk, that he believed that the primary gene pool of the Harlem Renaissance was the talented 10th. He believed that 10% of the Black population were the educated, elite, civilized, he didn't say civilized, but I just say educated elite group. He believed that this group was the group that would help lead Black folks into a better tomorrow, right? Many people looked at this as being very elitist, right? But he felt that this will be the group that will improve our outcomes and position and help uplift the race. And I was thinking about this as I was looking this up, and I wanted to ask you, do you think this is a Black version of eugenics? Do you think this is kind of like eugenics? Eugenics suggested that there was this specific group that white people were the pure, the civilized group, all the way down to their genetics, and trying to mix this group with other groups would sanitize the gene pool and basically diminish the power and the ingenuity of the human race. And so we need to keep it pure because this is the leader of the human race, the white race. And do you think that this talented 10th idea is a Black version of eugenics?
Does the talented 10th include people darker than a brown people have?
So not explicitly, but to some degree, yes, because a lot of the people that were part of the talented 10 were lighter skinned. But that's because mulatto people were the ones that were most likely to have access to, so, okay. You,
This is why they talk about Church School before.
mm,
That talented tenth is still around. They call it the boule.
mm,
Boule today
mm,
is the talented tenth.
mm,
If you find out who's in this talented tenth as of today, they're not even educators. People
right.
like P. Diddy is in the boule.
Mm,
And Jay-Z,
mm,
that is in that, I forgot what they call it, Sigma, Gamma or something.
mm,
But the boule is great, the talented tenth.
mm,
It's still around today. I was in Houston not too long ago. We had a discussion about
mm,
breakfast club.
mm,
And they had all these signs about talented tenth. So we looked up black people in there we were talking about, was that a good idea?
mm,
And when you look at where we're at now, it's almost like I'm the man in charge. You come over here, I'm gonna give you some crumbs off the table.
mm,
You keep the crumbs off the table. You and your family and the generations will be straight. But these other 90% is cursed. And then when you look at what's going on, as long as I got $1 billion, I'm not fighting for no black power. I'm over here with so what's so good. You know what I mean? And every once in a while, they want to, when the powers that be get mad, they want to throw an afro on, throw a fist up, try to get us back to it.
This is a point. So, and I don't know, this is something I was thinking about. I don't think that this goes as far as eugenics, right? Because eugenics was extremely harmful, violent, and was really the philosophical basis of World War II, right? Or not the entire World War II, but Nazi Germany, right? But I do think that again, we see, and it's important for us to unearth these divisions and the elitism that can exist in our community so that we don't continue to perpetuate them. And sometimes we do through what you're saying with Black Boule or sometimes in things like Jack and Jill and things of that nature. So we have to be mindful of these things. I'm gonna say this and I'm gonna get to you all and wrap up. Again, I always like to bring back local history, and we talked about Augusta Savage. Augusta Savage, born in Green Cove Springs, spent a lot of time in Jacksonville, Florida. She actually was a part of the Harlem Renaissance, and she was a sculptor, an amazing sculptor, right? And so she was a part of the Harlem Renaissance, and she actually started an art school in Harlem, right? Eventually, because of the Depression, it was bankrupted, and she lost her, Zora Neale Hurston, a lot of them lost a lot of their funding and a lot of their means of survival. So many of them, died not having a lot of money, but they were very significant to this movement, right? The Harlem Renaissance ended in the 30s due to the devastation of the Great Depression. However, that time period still influences and inspires Black art even today, right? Even music that is sampled in hip hop and R&B, sometimes is even music from this time period. So it's still that inspiration.